right, welcome back everybody to the garage. Hopefully the sound is okay and the visuals are okay. We've got the Farmertec 660 kit up on the table here. As some of you may know, I did a sort of review or check-in on this saw a year ago. And at that time it was 3.5 years since I built the saw. So it's 3.5 years old. It's now 4.5, 5 years old now. And in that video I talked about some of the things that I changed when I built this saw and how this saw has been to run and use recreationally and a little bit professionally too. So for those of you who haven't seen the previous video, I did change a couple of things when I built the saw, mostly the base gasket, intake boot, I think seals I did, and spark plug, a couple other minor things. But for the most part, like the saw is 90% Farmertec. It's Chinese. So that's the bottom end bearings, the crank bearings, the crank itself, the wrist pin bearing, the piston, the cylinder itself, the carburetor. The intake boot is OEM and the air filter is OEM. Those are two other things, but in any case, since that last video when I did that sort of in-depth discussion on the saw, I haven't changed anything else on the saw. Nothing else has failed, nothing else is broken. The only thing that's changed with the saw is that it started to be a little bit harder to start. It's definitely not hard to start. When I first built this saw, and for the first several years, it would almost always start on choke, that is cough, after the first or second pull, and then when you'd switch to high idle, it would run on the first or second pull, sometimes the first for both. It was a really easy starting saw. Oh yeah, I do have the elasto start on this because I broke the rope a couple times, and you know, the decomp is plugged on this, so it does kick over pretty hard, and so that's another thing that I changed, but I like it. I think it really does help. But anyways, the saw is a little bit harder to start. Sometimes it takes an extra pull or two to start it, but it's definitely not a hard starting saw. I don't have to pull and pull and pull. The gas cap has started to leak on this saw, and so I've started to store it outside in my woodshed, so it's covered, but it is outside, and it's been totally fine. It hasn't really affected the saw. It's always started and it's always run fine. So one thing that I didn't discuss in the previous video, and again, this is really just an update. Again, it's been 4.5 years and nothing else has failed on this, and it's still running really well. I'm really pleased with the saw for what I paid for it. And I understand that these kits have probably improved since I built this saw, but for my part and my 2 cents and my sample size of 1, this has been my experience. One thing I didn't talk about was the squish on this saw, and so it has the OEM cylinder on it, and I believe I put an OEM, so it's a Farmertec cylinder. I believe I put an OEM base gasket in it, and I never measured the squish, and I can tell which end of the solder I put in there if it's really carboned up. I have traditionally used a really heavy oil ratio in this saw because I was worried about the bearings. So anyways, I measured it off camera before I started, and I don't know if you can see that, but it's 25.5. So it's 25 thousandths, which to me is like really awesome. Anywhere between, you know, like 20 and 25 is really good. I don't really like, I mean, a little bit below 20 I think is okay in most cases, but 20 to 25 is really quite good. 25 to 30 is fine too. Over 30 I think is getting to be a little bit much. Having said that, I do have several saws that are well over 30 and they run fine. Maybe they could run better if the squish band was a little bit tighter tolerance, but it seems fine. Anyways, I just found that really interesting, that's what it came out to. So basically the long and the short of it is, it's been 4.5 years. I really did make minimal changes to this saw. I did run a heavier oil mix in it to start with. That being said, I milled with this a great deal. Just a lot of logs, a great deal of logs, mostly cedar, so it's, you know, easier cutting, but it's done a lot of the hours on the saw are at full throttle sustained cuts. Like I said, I did start a tree service in January of this year, and I do bring the saw out and I do use it for that occasionally. Tree service isn't quite like logging where you'd be using the same saw or one of two different saws for most of the day. When it comes to ground saws, at least, you know, most of my time in tree work is spent in the tree, and that's using the climbing saws, the little guys, and occasionally I'll use these, but long story short, the saw's been really good. What's most interesting to me is that after 4.5 years, the saw is still pretty easy to start. It's a little bit more difficult, like I said, than when I first put it together, probably in those first couple of years. I think it takes another pull or two to start sometimes, but you know, I think that it's just interesting. It speaks to the quality, let's say, of the components in the carburetor. I think that's pretty good considering the price that you pay. That's not to say that a 390 or a 372 it's comparable to those. I don't know that it is in terms of longevity and resistance to ethanol fuels and all that kind of stuff, but I think for the price paid, the saw has been really good value, and in my sample size of one, in my experience, it was definitely worth purchasing. Like I said in the previous video, I would not go out and buy a kit, and you guys already know this if you're a commercial faller or commercial tree service guy, and rely on that saw to make you money every day. I mean, it's fine to bring out, of course, and you can do whatever you want, but in my experience, or what I feel most comfortable doing, is I always bring a couple of saws, whether it's a Farmertec saw or 2 Huskies or a Still or Echoes. I always bring a backup saw because things happen, you pull a rope out or whatever, but it's just nice to have two. Bottom line, it's been 4.5 years. The saw has given me virtually no problems once I fixed kind of those little niggles that I talked about in the previous video, and that's sort of all there is to it. I would like to, in the future, take the saw apart and take this cylinder off and take a look at it. I'm really curious to see what the plating looks like, and you know, like what the measurements are on the piston and what the wear's been like, how shiny the top and bottom edges are, and so on. But we'll save that maybe for 5 years or maybe even 6 years. We'll see how we do, but yeah, that's been my experience. I hope you found this video helpful, and we'll see you next time.